This
person sitting
conference
on a
will
black
now be
horse,
recorded.
an image known around the globe and instantly associated with the country of Canada. I had the privilege of being part of this iconic group from 1974 until 2012, starting as a constable on the ride for 2 years, then returning to the training staff where I eventually rose to the position of riding master at the rank of sergeant major for the final 13 years. This evening, I will explain what the ride is and some of the changes I have seen in my nearly 40 years on the ride. Excuse me. My remarks will focus on a brief history of the ride, who the riders are, where the horses come from, the use of carriages, and finally the force's long association with the royal family. The musical ride is performed by 32 horses and riders executing traditional cavalry drill maneuvers and choreographed precision movements accompanied by appropriate music. The first part of the half-hour performance is done at the trot and the second half at the canter. Next couple of pictures, please, Kathleen. The second half is done at the canter, finishing with a simulated cavalry charge. Next one. Next. Okay. The riders are all regular police officers that volunteer to do the ride for up to 2 years. The main mandate of the ride is to travel across the country performing in support of local RCMP detachments and sponsored by local charities. The ride performs up to 100 shows a year and helps raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for local charities. It also travels internationally as goodwill ambassadors for Canada. The ride is performed in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Bermuda, Japan, and throughout the United States of America. Oh, I forgot Switzerland as well. And many of you who have been to the Royal Windsor Horse Show will recognize where this photo is. You can see in the background Windsor Castle. The ride is performed on numerous occasions at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. The origins of the ride date back to the early years of the Northwest Mounted Police, which was founded in 1873. In 1874, a small force of 300 men rode west towards the Rocky Mountains into what was then known as the Northwest Territories, which is the modern-day provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta, to bring law and order to the region. Many of the original officers came from British cavalry regiments and brought with them a tradition of mounted cavalry drills, which is the basis of the musical ride. The first 5 rides were performed in Regina in the winter of 1887 after the completion of an indoor riding school, after the formation of a police band and the arrival of Sergeant Major George Kempster, formerly of the British Life Guards, who had taken part in the first known musical ride in London, England in 1882. The success of these initial rides was short-lived as the riding school burnt down the following year and more pressing police duties precluded any further performances until 1901. The ride then only performed sporadically with no shows during the First World War. King Edward VII granted the royal prefects in 1904 and the force became the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. Then in 1920, it took over the policing of all of Canada, becoming the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that we know today. By then, horses and carriages were being phased out in favor of automobiles. However, horses were kept for training new recruits, doing mounted escort duties, and of course, performing musical rides. The last official mounted patrol took place at Big Beaver, Saskatchewan, on the Saskatchewan-Montana border, near where the famous Sioux warrior Sitting Bull crossed into Canada with his people after the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn. Despite this, horses continued to be used into the 1940s in some remote rural detachments. In 1960, the Canadian government recognized the public relations benefits of the ride and made it a permanent annual entity. In 1966, it was decided that it was no longer practical to keep horses for training policemen who would never use them for policing. At that time, there were two musical rides, one in Regina and one in Ottawa, so both were amalgamated in Ottawa. With the end of riding and training, the ride lost its pool of potential riders, so it started relying on volunteers from the force, a practice used until this day. The volunteers come to Ottawa for a 5-week selection course where they are judged on their ability to ride or projected ability to learn, their appearance in uniform, their ability to work well within the group, and possibly most importantly, their ability to be good ambassadors for the force and for the country. The successful candidates then return for a 6-month course where they hone their riding skills and learn the basic ride movements, after which they go on to the ride for 14 to 16 weeks of intensive practice before heading out on the road. In 1974, the year I started with the ride, a significant event took place in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and that was that women were finally allowed to join the force. It wasn't until 1981 that the first two women joined the musical ride. Then in 1986, Christine Windover became the first female instructor on the ride. Women have played an important and significant role on the ride ever since. On the 2013 musical ride, the sergeant, both corporals, and half the constables were female. The following year, for the first time, a woman became the officer in charge of the whole musical ride branch. The training staff of 8 corporals, 3 sergeants, and 1 sergeant major are traditionally musical ride graduates who rotate through 3 units. One training the new riders, the second training and traveling with the musical ride, and the third training the horses. The horses used by the force have also evolved throughout the years. Of the 310 horses that started the march west back in 1874, 83 died due to the harsh conditions and many others were rendered virtually useless. From 1878 to 1882, a breeding program was established at Windsor Creek, Alberta, attempted to raise suitable horses for the force, but the program ended when the members running the farm were needed for more pressing police duties. Horses then continued to be purchased until Commissioner Stewart Zachary Taylor Wood, who was the great-great-grandson of President Zachary Taylor of the United States of America, established a permanent breeding program in Regina in 1939. He had been in England and seen the lifeguards in London wearing their red uniforms and riding all black horses and thought that presented a splendid picture. When he became commissioner, he ordered the creation of a breeding program in Regina to raise all black horses for the RCMP. They first employed thoroughbred stallions and mares of different breeds to raise horses suitable for training and for musical ride purposes. In 1942, a ranch was purchased at Fort Walsh, Saskatchewan, and remained there until 1968 when it was relocated to Pakenham, Ontario, near Ottawa. In the 1970s, the RCMP started using warm blood stallions, first a Trakehner, and then with the help of noted Canadian Hanoverian breeder, the late Bill Mulholland, Hanoverians were introduced and are the basis of the breeding program to this day. Next picture, please. This is a picture I took in 2014 of a horse named Fergus, and he's pretty well the ideal type of horse that we breed for. A horse between 16 and 17 and a half hands tall, with good conformation, a good disposition, and of course is black in color. Horses that don't meet the standard of color, size, and disposition are sold at public auction. The breeding farm usually keeps approximately 20 mares and a few stallions, but also makes use of artificial insemination. The next picture, please. And this shows former farm manager out in the field with some of the yearlings. The young horses stay at the breeding farm until the summer of their third year, when they are brought to the stables in Ottawa to be trained by the musical ride staff. In recent years, civilian trainers at the breeding farm have done some of the basic training, and I believe since I have left, there's also civilian trainers at the RCMP stables in Ottawa. After approximately 2.5 years, the horses are considered physically and mentally mature enough to go on the musical ride. The goal is to try and have 6 new horses go on the ride every year. The horses that are replaced usually join a group of approximately 30 horses that are used for training new riders, as well as performing other duties such as parades and escorts when the musical ride is out on tour. They also keep 6 to 8 horses for carriage duties. Carriages and wagons have been part of the force since its inception. The main carriage in use today is a Landau that you see here in this picture that was built in the 1890s in Melbourne, Australia, and purchased by Lord Hopetoun, Australia's first Governor General. At the time, the Landau was said to be the most ornate and expensive carriage ever built in the colonies, having been purchased for the then princely sum of £4,000 sterling. Lord Hopetoun returned to Great Britain with the carriage and eventually sold it to Earl Grey, who became Canada's 9th Governor General in 1904. Earl Grey brought the Landau with him and sold the carriage to the Government of Canada when he returned to England in 1911. The Landau has been refurbished twice since that time. First in 1970 by the late Walter Herdman of Ottawa, when the color was changed from the traditional claret and gold to the present dark royal blue. Next picture, please. And this shows the carriage with its original color in obviously a winter setting. And of interest in this picture is the gentleman in the carriage is Governor General George Vanier, and he was a hero of the First World War Battle of Vimy Ridge, where he in fact lost a leg. One of the duties that members of the musical ride perform is they travel both nationally and internationally to historical commemorations. And the next picture. In 2007, I was a part of a group of 3 that had the honor of attending the 90th anniversary of that famous battle of Vimy Ridge. And you can see us here with 3 horses that were loaned to us by the famous Garde Républicaine in Paris. And was our great privilege to escort Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip up to the rededication of the Vimy Memorial. Now, the next picture, please. So that the first picture that we saw with the Governor General was him on his way to the opening of Parliament, but the carriages are also used for taking new ambassadors to Government House to present their letters of credence to the Governor General, as well as escorting visiting heads of state. And the next picture is an example here with the late Nelson Mandela being escorted to Government House. Next, we have Her Majesty going to Parliament Hill in 1990. And whenever Her Majesty comes to Ottawa, she's exceptionally well received. As you can see, huge crowds all the way along. But the one day that possibly surpassed that is the next picture. And that was the day when Prince William and Catherine came to Ottawa in 2011. It was by far the biggest crowd and noisiest crowd I had ever been part of. They estimate close to 250,000 people turned out for that. When I came onto the riding staff in 1978, carriage driving did not occupy a high position in the minds of many of the senior staff of the day. I had a personal interest in driving and was able to convince the senior managers to engage my friend Barry Dickinson to give us a clinic on proper protocol as well as the care of the carriages and the harness. As a result of this successful clinic, there was a renewed interest in carriage driving and more vehicles and harness were required, or acquired, I should say. And the next picture, please. In the winter of 1989, I was sent to the Royal Mews at Buckingham Palace to see if the methods we employed were consistent with those used by the Mews. There, I had the opportunity to learn from then head coachman Arthur Scholl and deputy head coachman Alfie Oates, who I am with in this picture, returning from Hyde Park back into the Royal Mews Buckingham Palace. Later that year, the ride started a show called Sunset Ceremonies at the Ottawa Stables, and VIPs for each performance were taken to the viewing stand in a carriage. For this purpose, we acquired a Victoria carriage that had been built in Quebec City in the early 20th century. Next picture. You can see here the Victoria, we're taking former Governor General, the late Raymond Hnatyshyn, to the show. The event became so popular that we had to purchase a vis-a-vis so that more VIPs could be accommodated. Next picture. And we see here, I use this picture of the vis-a-vis because it has former Prime Minister Stephen Harper and his family in it. And Prime Minister Harper was a very staunch supporter of Canada's ties to the monarchy, which is the segue into the next section of this presentation. We now come to the long-standing and close relationship between the royal family and the RCMP. The Northwest Mounted Police was formed during the reign of Queen Victoria, and in 1897, the force sent a mounted contingent to take part in the colonial procession for her Diamond Jubilee. This was the first time that members of the force publicly wore the iconic Stetson, which would become an official order of dress in 1904. The ride has taken part in every coronation and jubilee since that time. When Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II became Queen in 1952, she also became the honorary commissioner of the force, as her father and uncle had been before her. It is well known that Her Majesty has a great love of horses and a fondness for the RCMP, so it was decided in 1969 to give her a musical ride horse. She was presented with a mare named Burmese, who would become one of her favorite horses. Her Majesty rode Burmese, seen here in this picture, for 18 consecutive birthday parades, also known as Trooping the Color. Burmese was retired in 1986, and since then Her Majesty is taken to the trooping in the Ivory Phaeton. To mark the centennial year of the RCMP in 1973, a gelding named Centennial was given to Her Majesty. And this photo from 1982 shows former American President Ronald Reagan riding Centennial and Her Majesty on her beloved Burmese riding in the Windsor Home Park. When President Reagan left the presidency, then Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney suggested the force present a horse to President Reagan. A gelding named Kelly was chosen and taken to California to be presented to the former president. In 1998, to mark the 125th anniversary of the force, it was suggested that another horse be given to Her Majesty as Burmese had passed away and Centennial was getting up in years. I was assigned the task of choosing an appropriate mount and chose a gelding named James. I spent a few months reschooling James and went over to London with him and was part of the official presentation at the riding hall at Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty eventually changed his name to St. James, and for many years St. James was the mount of the Prince of Wales at the Trooping the Colour. To mark Her Majesty's Golden Jubilee in 2002, she gave the force an Irish sport horse that she had named Golden Jubilee. That's the next picture. The mare was on the musical ride for a few years and then produced a number of foals for the force at the breeding farm. In 2009, to mark the 40th, the next picture. At the same time that Her Majesty presented us with Golden Jubilee, she also presented me with this picture of her mounted on St. James at Windsor Castle. In 2009, to mark the 40th anniversary of the presentation of Burmese, I was assigned to find another horse to be presented. I chose a gelding named Terror, whose name was changed with Her Majesty's input to George in honor of her father, King George VI. The presentation took place on the lawn at Windsor Castle, where Burmese and Centennial were presented. Then at a public presentation at the Windsor Castle Royal Tattoo. George has since replaced St. James as the mount for His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, at the Trooping the Colour. The next picture, please. Yes. While I was at Windsor Castle preparing for the presentation of George, I was there for 6 weeks. I had the great honor and privilege of riding out with Her Majesty on several occasions. And see here in this picture, I'm mounted on a Highland pony named Big Ben, while Her Majesty is on one of her favorite fell ponies named Emma. And the next picture shows us riding with my friend Mr. Terry Pendry, Her Majesty's Royal Stud Groom, out in Windsor Home Park. So in 2012 was Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee coming up. Next picture, please. And the year started out with a bit of a surprise for me, as the Royal Canadian Mint put out a $20 silver commemorative coin commemorating the presentation of the different RCMP horses to Her Majesty, and I appear on the picture with Her Majesty. So it was also that year, to mark Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee, it was decided to give her another horse, as St. James was now quite old. This time I chose a 5-year-old mare that I had named Elizabeth in honor of the late Queen Mother. The mare was only 5 and hadn't completed her training and hadn't been on the musical ride yet, so it was decided that I would once again go over early to get the mare habituated to all the sights and sounds that she would see. And as with George, what we did, we flew from Toronto over to Amsterdam, and then took a trailer to Calais, took a ferry across to Dover, and then drove to Windsor Castle, arriving late at night. After a private showing of the mare to Her Majesty, she surprised me by making me a member of the Royal Victorian Order. The order was created for the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897, and is for personal service to the monarch. I was the only Canadian to receive the MVO during Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee year. Next picture shows Elizabeth being presented to Her Majesty in the riding hall at Windsor Castle. We weren't able to do it outside as it was raining that day. And following the presentation, there was a reception at the cricket club. At the reception, Her Majesty was made Commissioner-in-Chief of the RCMP, an initiative of former Superintendent Greg Peters, now Usher of the Black Rod in the Canadian Senate. Her Majesty was also presented a presentation sword made by Wilkinson Sword with the Force's battle honors inscribed on it. That evening at the finale of the Diamond Jubilee celebration at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, I rode in with the famous American horse whisperer Monty Roberts and my friend Terry Pendry, Her Majesty's Royal Stud Groom, all three of us members of the Royal Victorian Order. On the 23rd of May that year, the 23rd of May is also the anniversary of the RCMP. Her Majesty allowed the ride to replace the famous lifeguards on Horse Guards Parade. It was the first time a foreign non-military unit performed the 24-hour mounting of Her Majesty's lifeguards at Buckingham Palace. And while riding past the palace, Her Majesty could be seen watching from one of the windows, which was quite an honor for us. On the 1st of July 2012, I took part in my final Governor General's escort to Parliament Hill for Canada Day and officially retired on the 12th of July after 41 years, 37 having been spent on the ride, which is longer than anyone in the history of the force. I came back briefly in 2014 to help out with the carriage driving and finished on November the 11th driving the Victoria with the Princess Royal Princess Anne to Government House, then giving her a tour of the RCMP stables. In 2010, when Her Majesty visited Ottawa, she gave me this picture of herself with both George and St. James. And then just before Christmas of 2014, I received the next picture, please. I received this picture of Her Majesty with Elizabeth, George, and St. James, which was very timely as shortly thereafter, unfortunately, St. James passed away. When I went over with the Carriage Association of America to Her Majesty's 90th birthday celebration at the 2016 Royal Windsor Horse Show, I was unexpectedly invited to the private presentation of a horse named Sir John, formerly named Fergus, that horse that I had shown you earlier in the presentation. After the presentation, Her Majesty gave the ride a rocking horse crafted in the image of Burmese. At the 2017 Trooping the Colour, Prince Charles rode George and Princess Anne rode Sir John. Fittingly, 2017 was Canada's 150th anniversary, and Sir John was named after Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. In 2016, Her Majesty had the mare Elizabeth bred to a Hanoverian stallion named Viscount, and in early 2017, she gave birth to a lovely black filly, which Her Majesty named Victoria. Her Majesty has since given Victoria back to the RCMP musical ride, and I believe she's presently at the breeding farm. And this brings us full circle from the force being formed during the reign of Queen Victoria, and hopefully through this young filly, the legacy of the force's ties to the monarchy will continue. And just a little added note here, last year the RCMP gave Her Majesty two other horses, one a big gelding named Darby, And last year, for the first time ever, there were 3 royal colonels, all mounted on 3 former musical ride horses during the annual Trooping the Color. So we were quite proud of that. So that brings to an end this part of my presentation. And I would like to, if I could, Kathleen, make a quick shout out and thank you to my good friend Barry Dickinson for all his help over the years with the history and of carriages and such, and also to my friend Linda Rivington, who was a great help in putting together this presentation.
Yes, yes. I think that this was a very wonderful presentation. I know Barry was trying to get on to be able to listen, but I don't think he made it. That's okay. He'll watch it later. And he was called earlier this week and was very excited about you speaking. So sure he'll have fun. Now, if anyone has a question, you can go ahead and put it into the chat area. And Judy had made a note earlier this evening that she remembers the Royal Canadian Mounted Police coming to do demonstrations at the New York State Fair during the 70s.
Yes, I was there with the ride during the bicentennial year. We did fairly extensive tours of the United States that year. We actually started at the Rose Bowl Parade in January and finished up at the Macy's Day Parade, but New York State Fair was one of our stops as well.
Fantastic. So we did have a question come in, and does the ride primarily use mares, geldings, or stallions, or a mix of them?
We don't use the stallions on the shows, but it's a mix of geldings and mares, just whatever Mother Nature sends us. Some years it's 50-50, some years there's more mares or geldings, but we don't have any particular preference.
So you're definitely looking more for disposition and color than anything else.
Yes, that's exactly it. And rideability is very important because as I'm not sure that I mentioned it in the presentation, but probably 80% or more of the applicants for the musical ride have never ridden before. So with only 6 months of training under their belt, it's pretty important to have horses that have got a good rideability. And because we're in the public eye and we have the public come up and greet the horses and riders, we need horses that have got very good temperament, because it wouldn't be very good if we had them biting people.
Yes, that would not be good.
No.
So you mentioned that most of the people have only 6 months of instruction under saddle. How much training do they get for driving the carriages, and who does that training?
Well, the carriage drivers are members of the training staff, and some of them get some pretty significant driving, especially during the winters. And we've also been able to continue a good working relationship with the Royal Mews, and they have, I understand, since I've left, they've been over a couple of times to help keep our staff up to snuff, if you will, on the driving. And they've also allowed us to send some of the training staff over to the Royal Mews for a couple of weeks at a time. So that's been really, really beneficial.
That's fantastic that you've been able to maintain that relationship. Sally mentions that she did meet you a couple of years ago at the Carriage Symposium when you gave a talk there, which is also the first time I met you. She, after your meeting, was able to purchase one of the commemorative coins and wants you to know that that is now a prized possession. So she's quite thrilled about that.
Well, that's very nice. I'll have to get one of
Katie,
those myself.
Katie would like to know how many times has the ride traveled to Royal Windsor?
Oh, wow. I would think approximately, I'm just guessing right now, I'd say a half dozen times. During my time, we were there in 1988, 2000. Yes, I'd say at least a half dozen times.
So that's still quite a unique situation for you. And when you do that, do the horses travel with you? All the horses travel with you?
We normally travel with 36 horses, 36 horses, and with the riders and all the equipment and everything. It's logistically a pretty big event, and it's also the reason we don't get to Europe as often as we'd probably like. Is it, as I'm sure you can appreciate, it's quite expensive. But
I would imagine.
yeah, and the sponsors have to pay. Uh, all the expense except the riders' salaries, obviously. So it's we usually have to try and line up a fairly extensive tour. I know in 1988 we were 73 days touring Ireland, England, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, which I'd forgot to mention in my preamble. We've been to Switzerland a couple of times.
And is there a limit to the years of use that each horse has, or does it depend on the individual animal?
Exactly that. It just depends on the animal. As you know, horses are kind of like people. Some have got great longevity, and others through injury or illness at quite young age have to be replaced. But we've had horses that were still performing in their early 20s, and then we've had them then go to training the new riders, and can be into their mid to late 20s, some of them.
Excellent, excellent. It you were telling me when we were in our practice session that for some of the horses, the biggest challenge is to be able to stand for as long as they have to stand at presentations.
Well, yes, like getting horses to stand and not move for things such as the trooping the color, where the horses that take part in that, where George and St. James have done very well at that, is they're very good at standing while all the commotion around them's moving or going on. And a lot of horses aren't all that keen on standing. So it takes either a special kind of horse or it takes a little bit of training and exposure to get them to do that.
Well, those horses certainly have been excellent representatives for you. Katie would like to know if there is still an auction for the horses that don't meet the criteria. Her father, Fred Whaley, had bought a horse in previous years.
Yes, I remember that. And you know what, Katie? I'm not sure. I think there is, but I've been retired for now a little over 8 years, and I know things have changed. I know there was an auction a couple of years ago, but she would have to go online on the website. There's a website that you could find that information.
Excellent. Well, Bill, we very much appreciate your time doing this for us, and I know that we kind of interrupted your golf experiences there last week, and but
That's
I
not
think
much of an interruption.
Everyone has really enjoyed this presentation. We have comments coming in, and Jill says the ride is always a highlight for her. Thank you so much. So very interesting.
Well, thank you again for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it, and all the best to you and Jill, and we'll talk soon, I hope.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. We really appreciate it.
Okay then. Bye-bye, Kathleen. Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.